Okay, this is the second part for progressivism. I'll tell you this section may not have the interesting stories to go with it like prohibition did or suffrage did, but there are a lot of these things that will be on the Florida EOC. Most of this is building off of things that we had earlier in Unit 6 and going on. For the standards, again, there are a lot of these that you see that are over a broad amount of time and changes that were made over time. When it comes for the bracketing dates, realistically, the main focus of this section will be pretty much the presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, which will be the first 20 years of the 1900s. But it does connect to things that are before and after. All right, the first thing, this is where we will have, for the reforms that were made in progressivism, one thing that you have to look at is that they are mainly going to be reforms that are based upon the people and giving more power to the people there. This is all going against the political machines that we had earlier in the 1800s. So you remember the fight against Tammany Hall and those political machines. The first thing is direct primary. What happened with the primaries, and if we'll use a presidential election as an example, as the most well-known primaries, instead of the party bosses picking out the candidates, we have a series of primaries and caucuses. Today it will start in Iowa, then New Hampshire, then going on to Nevada and South Carolina, then we have Super Tuesday. But instead of a few people that are high up in the political parties, we then have it where the people are able to choose. A secret ballot is pretty straightforward. The political science name is Australian ballot, but then you could go. So it was a battle against political machines that if you no longer, your boss wouldn't know who you voted for. The 17th Amendment, where we had this in our amendments quiz that you had to know with that. It was the direct election of senators. The original Constitution of the United States had it where the senators were chosen by the state legislators. So if that was the case in 2022, we would have 120 members of the House and the Senate of Florida that would pick our senator. But we don't have that. Marco Rubio will probably be running for re-election. It'll be elected again by the people. Our original Constitution, the only position that was directly elected was the House of Representatives. This will open it up. We still, for the president, has to go through the Electoral College, and for the Supreme Court, it is not elected by the people. It is nominated by the president and then approved by the Supreme Court. These three words here are ones that you're going to go a lot more into, and for government, you need to not only be familiar with them, but make sure that you know what each one is. Initiative is a way for people to propose a law. The way that this is done is usually in a petition style. In the state of Florida, we recently had this done with the amendment being for raising the minimum wage to $15. It started with an initiative. You had some people that wrote up the proposition. It had to be approved by the Florida Supreme Court. They then had to have several 100,000 registered voters that signed on to it. It was then put on the ballot, which is then what's called a referendum. And people can vote on a law. For Florida, we add it directly to the Florida Constitution. So that is where the minimum wage would then be increased there, because over 60% of the people voted for that. A recall election is similar in the petition style, but if you have a politician that hasn't done anything illegal, but people feel like they're not doing their job, you have a petition that you want to have a recall election. You then vote to remove the elected official before their term is over. So there may be 2 years remaining, and you vote for them. The most famous recall election in the last couple of decades has been in California, when they had recalled Governor Gray Davis, and that is where that we'll have Arnold Schwarzenegger first get elected as governor. Make sure you know all four of those words and their definition. Again, all of these are things that are done during the progressive era that give more power to the people. For government efficiency, this is where part of the idea that you have in the progressivism is to be more efficient, not just in business with Taylorism and what Henry Ford will do with the assembly line, but also in government. Now, I have city manager up here. In our local area, we have a county administrator. Many places have a school board superintendent that's appointed. It's all the same idea. Instead of having someone elected, you have someone that is running the job and they're not worried about political pressure. So the city manager of Inverness, when it comes to giving a contract for garbage disposal, they won't worry about who's voting for what. They will pick what is best for the city that you have. Robert La Follette is a person you need to be familiar with. You don't have to for regular government. I mean, for regular history, know him as in depth, like an AP you would have, but you need to be familiar with him. For many years, he was seen as like the leader of the progressives. Wisconsin will have a lot of these things like the initiative and referendums that are started there. And this is where even today we speak about laboratories of democratic experiments there, where our recent election and where Pennsylvania in 2020 had a lot of mess ups for their. They'll look at other states. What did they do right for their election and change things when it comes to mail-in ballots and those things. You should recognize all those names except for maybe Brandeis, who we haven't had yet. He will come up in the near future as a progressive Supreme Court justice. All right, tax changes. Another thing that's, again, not real exciting, but our tax system that we had was still basically what was written in 1789 by Alexander Hamilton, which was great at that time period when 90-something% of Americans were farmers. Now that we have it where only around half of Americans were farmers, that was definitely outdated. So what was being called for was to have a income tax there, and so it had been done during the Civil War, but there was question whether it was constitutional or not. So the 16th Amendment will be passed that will allow for an income tax. Originally, that was proposed in the 1880s and 1890s by farmers and the Populist Party there. So it will come about 25 years later. And this is when we were on that section that I kept referring to things that were suggested at that time that will come about later on. The Underwood tariff is another thing that they had suggested that will lower the tariffs, and for a while we had lower tariffs. They're going to be raised again in the 1920s, which we will see what were the effects of raising the tariffs when it comes for the Great Depression. Now, the term graduated income tax or progressive income tax, if you see the chart on the bottom, I mean, it's outdated now, but the idea is the more that you make, the higher the percentage of your salary that is taken out. The reason for this is if I'm making $50,000 there, and you see on that chart, I would get taxed at a tax rate of 15% there. But if my next door neighbor is making $500,000, he's going to get taxed at a rate of 35%. The reason for that is my $50,000, a lot more of my money goes for what we consider essentials, like food and shelter. Today, our tax rates are a lot less after the tax bill that was passed in 2017, sometimes called the Trump's tax bill. We also have things that today that a lot of people say we need to update our tax bill, because now we're talking about over 100 years that we've been going by this system. And over those years, we have a problem with a lot of loopholes that are done. Mitt Romney brought this up in the 2012 campaign when he was saying after loopholes, his actual rate of paying taxes was lower than what his own secretary's was. Because if he's rich enough, he's able to have lawyers to figure out and accountants to figure out what are the best loopholes and what are the ways that he can go about to legally not pay taxes there. Once again, with amendments where you have to know these progressive amendments, we had before the 18th and 19th. Now we've had the 16th and the 17th in this section. All right, one of the most famous things that Teddy Roosevelt's known is as a trust buster, where, and going back to Unit 6, where I was in class, say, when you think of trust, you need to think of what word? You see the word trust, you need to think monopoly, and I have you all always say it out loud in there. So, trust busting is monopoly busting. Roosevelt was heavily influenced by Ida Tarbell's book, but he does not go after Standard Oil. Now you see on there already, and there, Roosevelt's known for things, but Taft would actually do more, and Wilson also here. But Roosevelt made it so public for what he was doing, and he's the first to really go strongly to try to break up some of these monopolies. One of the most famous ones that was when he went after J.P. Morgan's railroad companies. Now, J.P. Morgan by this time had bought out Carnegie's U.S. Steel. He has taken over General Electric. So most people thought he was the richest man in the world. Rockefeller was, but they thought J.P. Morgan was richer, but he had other people's monies also that he was investing. But he was the most powerful man in the United States financially. So he will break up that monopoly there, and he will use a lot of this as to kind of show. Now, 7 years later, the United States is going to be in a panic, and Roosevelt's going to need Morgan's help here. And Morgan could have gone and told him to pound sand, but instead he actually does help out the United States and acts with what later on we're going to have the Federal Reserve. He does a lot of things that the Federal Reserve will do in the future. It wasn't all done out of the kindness of his heart, because his company with U.S. Steel will get the contract for all the steel used in the Panama Canal. This is a thing that I want you to kind of look at, and we're going to be watching a video about Teddy Roosevelt, and this phrase that he was more of a trust regulator than a buster, and that's where he will do things to try to ease up there and have more regulations there. So he made a lot of noise in what we call a bully pulpit there, but Taft will actually do more of the actual busting up. Now, the Clayton antitrust is anti what? Should be thinking monopoly there. It does the same thing that was written on the Sherman Antitrust Act that we had back in Unit 6, but now they have the enforcement provision. I will tell you that historically you will have a question on either the Sherman Antitrust Act or the Clayton Antitrust Act on your EOC. It's pretty straightforward if you remember that antitrust is anti-monopoly, and the idea is that we want to break up these monopolies to make it where there's a better chance for competition. A lot of times they will have various political cartoons that when we're doing a lot of our political cartoons activities, this is something that they will have, but that's reoccurring question on the EOC. All right, this next thing is where there's a lot of stuff that is occurring. Started with the Interstate Commerce Act and in the late 1800s, but it continues in the Progressive era and more regulation of businesses. You don't have to know the Elkins Act and Hepburn Act by name, but both of these were going to be bills that will go and regulate the railroads, which was the most powerful industries. Like, one of the things that would do is make it where they cannot give rebates or a discount to one person. What you'd have to do is have that open to everybody. So like if Ford has a $2,000 rebate, they can't just make it to a business. They have to have that open to everybody. Or if you have coupons, it's for everybody. The Federal Trade Commission looks pretty straightforward here. It is to regulate trade and businesses. That was established. Earlier in last section, we had the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, and the Keating-Owen Act. All of these are regulations over businesses. And this is where the Progressive era will continue what had happened in the late 1800s, and we'll have a lot more things that are for the people there. The era of laissez-faire and caveat emptor was going to be over. This next thing is really important. The Federal Reserve Act was established in 1913. I know it's only one line in the notes here. You're going to have an entire section in economics about monetary policy. When our country first started, Alexander Hamilton had pushed through the first bank of the U.S. We will have a second bank of the U.S. We will then have a bank war with Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and the bank will be killed, but then it'll come back and forth for the next couple decades. Abraham Lincoln will revive it during the Civil War, but it goes away for a while. Again, J.P. Morgan had to do some of the things that would be almost like monetary policy, where his bank was so powerful, but this was passed in 1913. And it is still around today. It is supposed to be nonpartisan. The idea they have is to try to make sure to help control inflation and help the economy. We don't want to go up too fast, but we also, if we don't go up too fast, we also won't drop as quickly. So where before the Progressive era we had so much of this up and downs, and the Federal Reserve Act, it's still gonna need more help and learn from things, and the Great Depression in the future will be an example of this. All right, conservation. I'd love to spend a lot more time on this there, and this is where you're going to need to know what the difference is between conservation and preservation. Teddy Roosevelt was known as the president that had done more for the environment. He will actually set aside more land than any president. President Clinton will actually have more. Obama will actually set aside more land, but most of that he had done under executive order was reversed by Trump in the first 2 years of Trump's presidency. So Clinton, of what's long-standing of land that was set aside, there has the most. But Teddy Roosevelt had done it. He was good friends, and this is where for John Muir, who is the founder of the Sierra Club, and if you want to say, I mean, who's the founder for the environmental movement, it would be John Muir. Now, John Muir believed in preservation. Preservation is you think to preserve it, have it as natural as possible. Leave it alone. Don't let people even take hikes or anything like that in some of the areas in there that we want to make sure that it's 100% natural. Meanwhile, another one of Roosevelt's friends there, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, he will be believing in conservation. Now, conservation, you try to keep things natural as much as possible. You may have some areas that are preserved, but the idea is to set aside as much land as possible to conserve it there. I always use it as an example in class of the Withlacoochee State Forest. Right here, I mean, as a bird flies less than a mile from here, you can be in the Withlacoochee State Forest. And the pine trees are natural there, but pine trees growing in straight rows aren't so natural. So they have areas that is planted pine there, but you have areas that are swamps and areas like that are being preserved, but many acres that aren't. Here's where today we take it a little step further for conservation, where we have Forever Florida. And Forever Florida, we'll even have it give tax breaks to people for pastures and orange groves. So yes, it's definitely not the way that nature would have intended, but it's more natural than rows of houses that we have in some places of Florida. So to help out for animals in some areas and connecting them to get together. We will have some differences. Again, John Muir for preservation, and even though he was a very close friend for Teddy Roosevelt, Roosevelt went ahead and went with Pinochet's idea and will go with more the conservation. That's because he figures he could set aside the most land of all. Under Roosevelt, we will then have the Antiquities Act that is passed. The Antiquities Act will allow the president to set aside land. Later on, this will lead into the national park conservation, and this is where, I mean, we have pictures that are famous of Roosevelt when he's at the Grand Canyon. So he doesn't make it a national park, but he sets aside the land where later on it's a national park in here. Here's where, for example, of the first national monument was Devil's Tower in Wyoming, where he set aside that land to be not touched there that you have. All right, Teddy Roosevelt, for his domestic policy, it is called the Square Deal, where his foreign policy was the big stick policy, if you remember, the Square Deal. And this is where, in his second term, he wanted to expand upon the measures that were done in the first term. He wasn't sure how popular he was, because if you remember, he came to office after McKinley was assassinated, so he really wasn't sure of himself. And then in the 1904 election, he will win by a huge margin, and he realizes at that time, and he can use that bully pulpit. So he's wanting to do things to help out people, and this is where when you hear the word progressive, the idea is to help out the common person in here. Some of the things that he'll do, he'll be the first to arbitrate a labor dispute. Doesn't mean that he goes always on the side of labor, but he at least had the labor and the factory owners come to the table together. Now, a lot of what he was doing will end up getting stopped, because when we go into panic of 1907, the recession will make it where that is the priority that is done in there. And this is where I told you about that he had to ask J.P. Morgan for help, because that was before there was the Bank of the United States or the Federal Reserve in there. And that's when he agreed not to bust up the U.S. Steel Company. Roosevelt will retire or resign after, or not run for re-election, actually, for the 1908 election. He could have ran there. Historically, everybody stepped down after 2 terms, and he would have had a little bit of an out since he did not serve 2 full terms. He'd only been president for 7.5 years. But he had stated, and before he ran for election in 1904, that he wasn't going to run for re-election. He really was disappointed that he did that. But he will handpick William Howard Taft to succeed him. Now, Taft was the type of guy that if you needed something to be done and done right, you put him in charge. He's not exciting. He actually didn't want to be president. His wife wanted the idea of being president. Taft wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. And later on in life, he will be a justice the court. But he's handpicked by Roosevelt in there. Taft will easily beat William Jennings Bryan, which if you recognize that name, yes, he loses again. This is the third time that William Jennings Bryan will lose as he's running for president there. The Taft administration will continue many of the progressive things that were done in the Square deal. He's going to do more trust busting, and he will even go after U.S. Steel. After Carnegie dies and Roosevelt's no longer president, Taft will go after breaking up that. But what ends up happening is he doesn't do as much as many of the progressives wanted there. And so there's going to be a split in the Republican Party between the progressive and what will be the conservatives there. And the conservatives are going to be the ones that are supporting Taft along the way. So we have our two groups. Meanwhile, Taft's friend Roosevelt, well, he's not too happy about what happened, and like Roosevelt's going to be upset. He's actually does like a worldwide tour, goes on a safari hunt in Africa, and he keeps hearing about these things that Taft's doing, and he's upset because Taft's not doing things exactly the way Roosevelt will want. So he will come back, and he was actually quite brilliant. Today, we almost thought like much of like what we've seen with President Trump in the way that he was tweeting. Roosevelt would have probably been one that used Twitter incredibly in there, but he was constantly slinging insults at Taft, making fun of him where he was overweight there. But the Republicans will end up with this split, and what will happen is when they get to the convention, Taft will end up being chosen for running for president. The progressives are going to be upset. They are going to then go and make their own party. The leader of the Progressive Party originally was Follette, but then President Roosevelt, or former President Roosevelt, will take the reins. It's going to be known as the Bull Moose Party after he was shot in there, and then he had made the statement about he was tough as a bull moose. But yes, when he was running for president, somebody tried to assassinate him. His glass case and folded up papers for his speech will end up stopping the bullet. He is bruised, he's bleeding, but he goes ahead and gives this speech afterwards, and this is where that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. So the Progressive Party became known as the Bull Moose Party. Now, we have the Republicans, and then we have the progressives that broke off of them. We have the Democrats. We have more groups, though. The Socialist Party. For socialism, they wanted to have for major industries not to be just broken up there, but they wanted things like the steel industry, coal industry, railroads to be owned by the government there. And what ends up happening is the Socialist Party, most people don't realize this in our history, but in the early 1900s, it will be a pretty powerful third party. You're going to see the 1912 election where Eugene Debs will get quite a few votes. He'll run for president 5 times. During the Red Scare, he'll actually even be in prison. There are going to be multiple cities in the north, like Milwaukee and Chicago, that have a lot of city council people and even mayors that are from the Socialist Party. So it was a very powerful third party before World War I there. For a short period of time, our biggest labor union will be the IWW, the International Workers of the World. They were nicknamed the Wobblies. Their leader that made them to where they were so powerful was Bill Hayward. Now, they would only be for a short period of time that they will be stronger than the AFL. What will end up happening is afterwards in the Red Scare, they will end up going away. Reason being is that the International Workers of the World is an international union, and they are going to be connected with the Bolsheviks, which will have the communist revolution for Russia there. So this is where that once we get to the Red Scare after World War I, that the IWW will kind of go away, and that's where the the AFL once again become our largest union. The story is true where William Howard Taft did get stuck in the bathtub. They had to put a bigger bathtub in. So here's a political cartoon kind of making fun of Trump with that. All right, the election of 1912 was one of the biggest elections in U.S. history. We will have the incumbent President Taft running for re-election. The person that will eventually win, Woodrow Wilson, will be running. Former President Roosevelt is going to be running for the Progressive Party, and Eugene Debs will be running for the Socialist Party. This is the one time in history that a third party will get more votes than one of the other parties, because Roosevelt, as a Progressive Party, you'll see on that map, gets the green states where Taft didn't win much. Now, if we put together Taft and Roosevelt's voters, they would have easily won this election. The Republicans would have, but the Democrats were able to win. And on the one pie chart, it's kind of small, but you'll see in here that sliver of white, and you will see that the Socialist Party actually did get a pretty good chunk of the popular vote, even though they didn't win any electoral votes. You won't have a not question on the EOC, but here's one time that William Jennings Bryan wasn't in election. But again, there were 3 different presidents in that election. All right, Wilson, we kind of covered a few of the things along the way for what was done while he was president. Again, he will actually be very big on breaking up different trusts and monopolies. He was on the rate for doing a lot of that, but then will come World War I, and it stops. The Federal Reserve was established while he was president. The Federal Trade Commission with regulations over business will be established. The tariff being reduced was under him that time. The Clayton Antitrust Act. So all these things we had before, this will happen during Wilson's presidency there. Now, in what ways was Wilson not progressive? This is where, for African Americans, that Wilson was definitely not a friend for African Americans. He actually will establish in many of the federal buildings segregation that you would have, and where he was from Virginia. So some of the steps that we're taking federally were stepped back during Wilson's presidency. And what stopped the progressive movement, if you haven't figured out by now, where I've mentioned a couple different times, World War I. So all these massive changes that we had between pretty much about 1903 to 1917 and there, this will pretty much come to a halt with World War I. And then after World War I, we will have the 1920s, which we go to a more conservative era.